probably be like quarter to 2 to 3, depending on how long it takes.
You're on, sir.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you everybody for coming to our seminar. This is the first seminar, of course, of the semester, and it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Owen from Math Department at NCSU. She's also a postdoctoral fellow at the SEMSI. For those of you who don't know what SEMSI is, it's the Center for Applied Math and Statistical Science between NC State, UNC, Duke, and the ISS. And she received her PhD in Applied Mathematics from Cornell University in 2008. And she's working in the area of algebraic methods and system biology. And what she'll be talking about today is some of her recent work in tree spaces. And it's a pleasure to have you, and look forward to the talk. Thank you for coming.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me. So, okay, so let's get started. So, I'm going to be talking about a space of phylogenetic trees. So, what are phylogenetic trees? They represent the evolutionary history of some different species. And so, basically, one of the big problems in phylogenetic trees is how to reconstruct them, right? Because at this point in time, we have our species, and we can get sequenced genetic data from them. And then from that genetic data, right, we want to reconstruct a phylogenetic tree showing the most likely evolutionary relationships. And so there's sort of some big questions here. So that's the first one. I mean, how do we even infer this tree from the data? And then there's other questions. So how do we compare two trees? These aren't numbers, right? We can't just add and subtract them. And also, how do we compute meaningful statistics on trees? So like things like confidence intervals or probability that we've reconstructed the correct tree. So I'm going to sort of zoom in a little. So those are sort of some of the overall questions asked in the area of phylogenetics. And I'm going to talk about a more specific question that was one of the ones I'm trying to address with my work. And this is the relation between gene and species trees. So we have species, so say fish, right? Each of these fish will have a copy of some gene. And that's actually what we're sequencing, right? When we sequence stuff, we usually sequence the genes. You might take one gene and reconstruct the most likely, so the gene we think was the same in all the different fish, and then reconstruct it to get a gene tree, right? And then we say, okay, that gene tree, well, that's probably the relation between the species. So that was sort of one approach. Now, there are problems with this approach in that we actually can get gene trees that don't match a species tree. So for example, right, this red tree, that could be a gene tree for another gene. But you can see here it's got a different topology than the species tree topology. Namely, it's branching off. So instead of these two fish being the closest, being related, having the most recent common ancestor, these two fish do, right, up here. And so this is sort of what people have realized, that the gene trees don't necessarily match a species tree. And it is actually what we'd expect. There's a whole theory of this, coalescence theory, that does say that we shouldn't expect every single gene tree to match a species tree. But if all we can measure is gene trees, right? That's what we're getting when we reconstruct from DNA. The question is, how do we infer the species tree from the gene trees? And what would be really nice is if somehow you could average the gene trees to get the species tree. And so that's sort of one of the motivations for this talk. Is that we're hoping that finding averages in tree space somehow leads us to that species tree. And then another motivation for some of this work, so for the distance part, the distance between phylogenetic trees I'm also going to talk about, is that there's just biologists do need to be able to compare phylogenetic trees. Right? For example, if two different genes have given you two different trees, maybe you want to see how far apart they are. Or if you want to even test your tree reconstruction algorithms, you need to be able to check back the tree you reconstructed with the tree it should have been. And so the space of phylogenetic trees I'm going to introduce, the idea is that it's going to provide a framework for hopefully studying and answering some of these questions. Okay. So what is this tree space? So basically it's a polyhedral complex. If you don't know what polyhedral complex is, you can also think of it as parts of Euclidean space glued together in a nice way. And then plus a metric. So that's sort of, when I said Euclidean space, you can already think of the Euclidean metric on it. So so a distance measure within this space. And this was introduced in the paper by Belair, Holmes, and Vogtman in 2001. And prior to this, there had sort of been some tree spaces, but they were just at this stage, so no metric on them. So just these polyhedral complexes. And then by putting on a metric, which is called the geodesic distance, we got this tree space. So in this tree space, so for tree space Tn, my trees are going to have n leaves, and their interior edges are going to have some length, either 0 or greater than or equal to 0. So by interior edge, right, I mean edges that are not ending in leaves, right? So these lengths here, these edges here that do end in leaves, I can put a length on them, and that's what biologists would want to do, right? Because often the length is representing something like number of mutations or rate of mutations. And so obviously, even as we're going down towards one species, right, we still could have mutations. But putting lengths there doesn't make the problem any mathematically harder. So I'm going to ignore them from my talk. But in the algorithm I have for computing these, it does include them. And then the trees, for the talk, I'm going to treat them as rooted. You can also think of the root as just being a leaf. So you don't need to have a rooted tree. But the idea of rooting them is sort of that this is the farthest back in time, and then they're all descended down. They can be either binary or multifurcating. So they can be degenerate, right? I can have, so this is binary, right? Because at every like, so speciation event, right, it just splits into two. But I can have trees in my space that split, say, 3 ways there. And then semi-labeled, because only the leaves are labeled, which makes sense biologically because we only know what exists at the present time, right? We don't know what the species were, sort of the ancestral species were. Yeah?
Are these directed?
No. So by putting a root, I am sort of directing them, but I don't need to have called 0 the root. That could just be some other species. Okay. So we need an idea, sort of a mathematical idea of what is an edge. And it's just going to be a partition of the leaves, right? So if I pull off this edge E3, right, if I think of removing it from my tree, I'm splitting my leaves in 2, right? I get 2 and 3 down here, and then I get 4, 5, and 1, and also the root in my other set. And so that's all an edge is. It's a partition of the leaves in 2. So if I want to talk about 2 edges being the same or being different, what it means is I'm just comparing, do they partition the leaves the same way or not? Okay. And I can also talk about 2 edges being compatible. So what does it mean if 2 edges are compatible? It means that they can exist in the same tree. If 2 edges aren't compatible or are incompatible, they can't exist in the same tree. And there's a formal definition where you just sort of check if these intersections of the parts of the partition, if one of them is empty. I only mention that so you know that this can be calculated. I can calculate if 2 edges are compatible quite easily using sort of bit set operations. So that's sort of the only reason I'm mentioning it. But you just want to think about it, 2 edges are compatible if they can be in the same tree. So if we look at this tree, then, so E2 and E3, these 2 edges, they're compatible because they're in the same tree, right? this is E3 is the partition of the leaves, 2, 3, and the rest. And then E2 is the partition of 2, 3, 4, and then the other leaves. And you can check, if I want to check this intersection criteria, for example, the intersection of 2, 3 and 0, 1, 5 is empty. So it meets that criteria. But this edge F is not compatible with E3. So what does this mean? This partition is telling me that I need the leaves 1 and 2 to be together, right, to form a pear or a cherry in my tree. But if I have the leaf 2 forming a cherry with 1 here, and E3 tells me that 2 is forming a cherry with 3, there's no way I can have both of those in the same tree. Right? I can't have 2 can't form a pair with 2 different things. So that's why F is incompatible with E3. And then you could also check that none of these intersections are empty. Okay. So now I'm going to describe the space. So I'm first going to tell you, so we're going to fix the tree topology. So think of just one shape, so one tree topology here, right, the way the tree branches. And what I have is I've got 2 interior edges, right, E1 and E2. And they're going to have some lengths. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to represent all trees with this topology, but different edge lengths, by a quadrant. So one axis of my quadrant is going to represent the edge E1, and the other axis is going to represent the edge E2. And then, depending on the lengths of E1 and E2, that's going to tell me what position that particular tree is in my quadrant. So, right, here's another tree, same tree topology, right, same 2 edges in it. But here E1 is longer, E2 is shorter. So this particular tree gets this point over here with a large E1 coordinate, right, small E2 coordinate. So that's how I can represent now every tree with this topology but different branch lengths would fit somewhere in this quadrant, depending on what lengths are. Yeah.
So here you're taking the weights into account then?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm always going to take into account the lengths or the weights on the interior edges. Okay. And so we can also put degenerate trees in here, right? So here's a degenerate tree. It's got three branches coming off, or it's got a multifurcating instead of just bifurcating. And what happened, right, is I let edge E2 have length 0. Like, think of just shrinking this edge to 0. That would go up there, and we get this tree here. And so it's on the E1 axis, right, because E2 has length 0. So I can also fit these degenerate trees into my tree space. So at this point in time, what I've told you is that for every tree topology, we have a quadrant. There's 15 different tree topologies with 4 leaves. So I've got 15 different quadrants. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you how to glue them together to get tree space. And it's actually done along these axes that are degenerate because, so let's look at this tree topology. Right, it's got same edge E1, right? E1 still splitting the leaves in that same partition. But this edge is making a different partition than E2. So, but when I shrink edge E3 to 0, I'm getting the same degenerate tree. So this quadrant for this tree and the quadrant for that tree, they have a same axis in common. So I'm going to take my 2 quadrants and glue them together along that common axis. So glue or identify or attach, whatever you want to call it, along that common axis. And so this is what I'm going to do in general, right? I'm going to take my 15 quadrants, and every time 2 of them share the same axis that represents the same edge, I just attach them together along it. And then the distance in this space is just, so within each quadrant, right, I can use a Euclidean metric. If I have a path going between several different quadrants, I can calculate the length of the path in each of the quadrants using the Euclidean metric, and then just add them up, right, to get the total length of my path. The geodesic distance is just the shortest path, the length of the shortest path between two trees. So in this,
Will these lengths be the same?
sorry?
Will these two lengths be the same?
These two.
The lengths from
Yeah.
your yeah.
Yeah. Here they would have to be E1. The length of E1 here would have to be the length of E2 if they're going to be this sort of straight line.
Right.
Yeah. So in this case, right, it's just that's the shortest path between them because I can lay these two quadrants flat and make it just like Euclidean space, and then the length of that would be the shortest path. And so you might be thinking now, well, can I actually get from every single tree to every single other tree? And you always can, because we can always shrink all the edges to 0 from our starting tree. So go to the origin, and then grow out all the new edges for the target tree, and go out. So in this case, right, that's not the shortest path, but sometimes it is. And that's something called the cone path. So we can always get from any tree to any other tree. So just to give you some more intuition about what the geodesic distance is so as you go along one of these geodesics, that's what the shortest paths are called, you can actually think of it, if you look at the trees as you go along it, that you're going from your starting tree and morphing the tree into your target tree. And so that's what this is. So this was my starting tree. The far one on the right, that's the target tree. And then we sampled, the trees in between are trees sampled evenly along the geodesic from this tree to the far one. And so you can see what happens, right? As we start moving along, the edges start shrinking. And then finally, these two shrink to be 0, and we're able to grow out a new one that's in the target tree over here, right? And then the last one from my starting tree shrinks to here, right? And then we start growing some more out. But even while, so this one, even though it shrinks it shrinks to 0 second, it's still been shrinking the whole way along. So we're sort of morphing one tree into the other. And then, okay, so try and give you some more. So this is 5 of the 15 quadrants in the tree space of trees with 4 leaves. And so what does this show? So here, tree 1 and tree 1 prime, they both have the same topology, right? They both look like that. But they would have different edge lengths, right? So here, E3 would be long, and in this tree, E1 would be longer. T2 and T2 prime, again, same topology, right? This topology here, again, and different edge lengths, right? T2 has a longer E4, T2 prime has a longer edge E5. Yeah?
Is there something that constrains the number of possible edges that you could actually grow? Because
you're talking about as I move between trees?
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're constrained to, you can't, we're going to get into that, but for instance, as we move along the geodesic, you never bring in an edge that's not in the target tree. For example, right? Like that would sort of be going out of your way if you brought in, like if I go from this tree to this tree, I'm not going to go like way over here and bring in this edge E2 that's not in either of my trees.
Okay.
And there's also some other, you also can't, if you drop an edge, you can't bring in an arbitrary one from your target tree. There's only certain combinations you're allowed to do. I mean, so that actually is a good question. I mean, which edges you're allowed to drop and bring in when is actually, it's not trivial, which,
Okay.
yeah. So what does this show? Yeah, so this shows too that there's, so what we have 2 pairs of trees, and the trees have the same topology, but it's different edge lengths. And you can see, right, that the geodesics go through have different, we can call it combinatorial type if you talk about which quadrants they're going through. Right, so this geodesic goes through this quadrant, whereas the geodesic between the 2 prime trees is the cone path, right? It must go through the center. And so for this reason, we see that this distance is depending both on the tree topology and on the tree and on the edge lengths. In contrast to some other distances for phylogenetic trees that just depend on tree topology. Where a lot of them, they sort of define some combinatorial move to move from one tree to another. You count the minimum number of such moves. Okay. And then finally, so those were only 5. The last picture right was 5 of the quadrants. This is all 15. And the way to read it is each of these edges here is a quadrant. And each of the vertices is one of my axes. And this is actually the Peterson graph. So you can understand why I couldn't actually put up a picture of the whole space earlier. Because it does sort of have this complicated structure. So we're lucky in that this space is, so in the original paper, Biller, Holmes, and Vogtman showed that this space is a CAD0 space. And what that essentially means is that it's non-positively curved. So if you think a sphere is positively curved, Euclidean space is flat, so 0 curvature. And then if you have hyperbolic space, that's negatively curved. Yeah.
Previous point. Are we determining the edge by all its descendants or just the immediate descendants?
So an edge is determined by, you can think of just remove that edge from the tree and you've partitioned the set of leaves in 2. So yeah, so there would be, so one partition would be all the descendants of down from that edge, and if there's several edges after it, it'd be all of them, and then everything else. Yeah, so okay, so this tree, so what we have here, that the tree space is non-positively curved, and that implies that the geodesics or shortest paths in it are unique. So this is a theorem of, does it follow from Gromov? It's like Gromov is involved with this stuff, if you're at all familiar with this kind of geometry. And so if there's a unique shortest path between any 2 trees, there's a unique midpoint along it. And we could think of that as an average of just 2 trees. And it turns out there's actually a way to sort of extend this to more than 2 trees. And so this sort of helps answer the question of why should we care about this distance when there's actually already a few out there for phylogenetic trees. And basically it incorporates both this topology and edge length. And then because of the unique geodesic, we're getting a way to average, an idea of an average for midpoint trees. And so we're going to see that we can actually compute mean trees on this space, which could be used to find some kind of consensus tree. So a species tree if we had a bunch of gene trees, perhaps. And then this is giving us this framework that would hopefully also let us do statistics on phylogenetic trees. Okay. So maybe just because this is not a mathematical talk, it's sort of some more practical people, I just want to show you that it does, I mean, this is also very nice, I just told you this theory, but it does also this distance does cluster biological data the way we would want. So what we have is we're comparing trees for 3 different types of flu strains. So type B, type H1N1, not the most recent kind, the one from before, and type H3N2. And we sort of generated random trees that would represent sort of representative of the kind of tree topologies given by each of the different flu strains, and then compared distance between them. So we had 30 trees total, 10 of each different type. And so we did multidimensional scaling to be able to project it onto, be able to show it. So these were all done by Sean Wan, who's a student of Katja Kuhl at Duke. And you can see that all the B trees representing the B flu strain are clustering, and then the A3 are the H3N2, or H2N3. I don't remember which one. And then the H1N1 are clustering down here. And then this is the same trees, but now clustered using the Robinson folds distance, which is one of the distances used a lot by biologists. So you can see that this geodesic distance is clustering biological data the way it should. It doesn't seem to offer that much improvement, but it's at least doing what it should be doing. And I'm sort of working with them. We're trying to do more experiments now to actually to sort of figure out how this distance is useful and how it can be used. And sort of what the strengths of this distance are versus the other ones. But basically, so the original paper came out in 2001, and why is this sort of, oh, we can actually cluster it using this distance, and this is 2010. So that's because until last year, there was actually not an efficient way to compute this distance. And so I proved it. So along with Scott Provin, who's at UNC, we proved there's a polynomial time algorithm to compute this distance. And you can, and it's, I'm going to talk about it now, but you can use it in trees up to like 500 leaves without any problem. So it's got good coefficients. And before that, there were only two other exponential algorithms. So geometry is from a group in Vienna, and then the geode maps was from my thesis. And then before that, there was also a root 2 approximation algorithm that was very fast in polynomial time. So basically, there was sort of this theoretical idea of tree space and distance, and until very recently, there were no algorithms to compute anything on it. And so it's just now that people are actually able to do the computations and start applying it to biological problems. Okay. So I now want to talk a bit about the algorithm for computing this distance. So since I think it's quite nice. So we first have to talk about, so if I'm going between two trees, so this is, my starting tree will be T1. I'm going to always label the edges with E's. And my target tree will be T2. I label the edges with F's. If I'm going to go between two trees, I've got to go through a sequence of tree topologies, right, as I go between. So in higher dimensions, a quadrant is called, the analog to a quadrant is called an orthant. So an orthant is just the positive part of Rn, or the non-negative part of Rn. Okay. So it's like an octant in R3, and then orthant is the n-dimensional version. Okay. So as I go between two trees, I have to go through some sequence of these orthants, and each orthant corresponds to a tree topology. And to get between tree topologies, what am I doing is I'm adding and dropping edges. So in this case, so when I talk about dropping edges, what I mean is I shrink that edge to be 0, to have length 0. So if I shrink E1 to have length 0, I get this tree here. And then by adding, I mean I grow out an edge. So grow out F. So I resolve this multiplication by growing out F1 from here to get a new tree. And then to move, say, to the next tree, I can do that by dropping E3 and adding F3. So shrinking E3, growing out F3. And then drop E2, add F2. But as I commented earlier, the sequence of adds and drops for these edges is not, there's sort of different ways you can do it. And it's not, for example, to be able to do it where you only drop one edge and add one edge, no, there are pairs of trees where you can't do that. At some point, you're going to have to drop two edges, for example. And so just to show you a different way to do it is I could have, say, dropped, here I could have dropped E2 and E3 and added in F3, and then dropped E1 and added in F1 and F2. And if you think, and so you can maybe imagine that there's some other ways. There'd be sort of a whole bunch of different ways I can do this. And each one of these add and drop sequences is corresponding to a sequence of orthants. And I'm going to call that sequence of orthants a path space. Right? So this tree corresponds to that octant. This tree here, it's corresponding to this quadrant, right? It's only got two interior edges. So that's why it's only a quadrant, right? Because each interior edge is corresponding to one of the dimensions. And then my final tree is corresponding to a final octant. And a lot of times I will sort of, because edges can only have positive or 0 lengths, I'm never using the negative part of the space. So when I draw these pictures, a lot of times I'll put coordinates, one coordinate on the positive side, one edge on the negative side. But you can think of tree space actually as sitting in a space with number of dimensions equal to the number of possible partitions of the edges. So so in terms of these path spaces, I can use them to characterize geodesics. And so basically the shortest path between two trees, it has to have there's three characteristics it has to have. And if it has exactly those characteristics, I know I've found the geodesic, my shortest path. And then the algorithm is based off of this characterization. So what's happening? As I transition between two orthents, I'm dropping some set of edges, which I'm going to call AI, and adding some set of edges called BI. And what I'm going to do is characterize, so get a characterization based on these partitions. And so what do we have, right? So I mentioned this briefly, but as I move from the starting tree to the target tree, I just keep dropping edges from my starting tree. And I keep adding edges from my target tree. And I never bring in an edge that's not in either tree, right? Or I never drop an edge and then add it back in later. So there was a theorem saying that if you are going along the geodesic, you don't do any of this stuff. Okay. So that means I can look at just these partitions. And the property 1 is that for all I bigger than j, AI, the set of edges AI is compatible with the set of edges bj. So that means they're compatible. They all exist in the same tree. And so this is just exactly what I've been telling you, right? That what does this mean? That for some intermediate tree, it's going to have the b edges we've brought in, right? So b1 up to b whatever. And then after that, it's going to have all the a edges still that we have left to drop. And if those all actually exist in the same tree, that just means those A sets and B sets have to be compatible. Because that's what it means for them to exist in the same tree. So that's just property 1. So it's a combinatorial condition on the trees. Right? It's talking about their combinatorics. Okay. So the next property is a metric property. So let's say we have a path space. So we've decided how we're going to add and drop the edges. And we're going to start in this octant here. And then we're going to drop E1 and E2, add in F1 and F2 to move over here to this octant. And then we just drop E3, add F3 to move down here. So let's say we decide these are the orthents we're going to go through, and we want the shortest path through them. Well, that path is going to have to go through the x3 axis, right? Because that was the only way I got from this orthent to these two. So what do we have, right? We have that, and you know that within any of these orthents, right, the geodesic has to move in a straight line, right? It's not going to wiggle around because that's not a shortest path. So I know I'm going to go from my point to somewhere on the x3 axis, right? So that part of the geodesic will lie in this plane formed by my starting tree in the x3 axis. And then I'm going to go in a straight line from the x3 axis down to my target tree. So this part of the geodesic also lies in a plane. But the two planes are bent, right? They're bent a bit. They're these half planes. What I'm going to do is to figure out where the geodesic actually crosses the x3 axis is I'm just going to unbend them. So I can isometrically map the part of tree space that I know contains a geodesic to a lower dimensional Euclidean space. So all I did is I took the part of tree space I knew contained the geodesic and I just basically unbent it. Right? And isometric mapping preserves distance. Yeah?
In this case, it appears as though it would be shorter if you go through the origin, isn't it?
Well, it's really close. So I'll show you. And it's also possible my picture is not completely accurate. So and notice too, right? I don't include this bottom part of tree space. So let's see what happens. So I can get my coordinates in my new space from the Pythagorean theorem. So everything, all the distances are preserved in my new space. And then if I do the straight line, right, you can see it's almost touching the origin, but not quite. Okay. And the idea is that I needed to have these points. If the straight line had crossed this area, the geodesic between these 2 points in this Euclidean space, if it crossed this area, then that would not be the geodesic because this was an illegal part, right? Because that empty space is corresponding to not being able to go through the space down here. So we're lucky, right, that it was a straight line here. And then this was an isometric mapping, so I can just map back my geodesic here back into this space. And it's sort of, I get the geodesic in tree space. And we also know how long it is too, right? Because we know how long a straight line is in Euclidean space. Okay, so what we actually want is we want to have chosen these A's and B's so that when I did map here, my straight line did go through the allowed region. So that's going to be the second characterization. As I'm going to get, I want some kind of characterization that ensures that my straight line went through the allowed region. The idea that is, if it doesn't, I should have picked some different A's and B's so that it really did. And so what are the coordinates here? Well, so I dropped E1 and E2. And this coordinate actually is just their norm. It's a Euclidean norm. And E3, that's just E3, the square root of E3 squared. And so that's also the norm of the edges in A2. Likewise, I can label my point down here as the negatives of the B's. And turns out that the condition required for that straight line to go through the allowed region is that the norm of the edges dropped in the first step over the edges added in the second step is less than or equal to the edges. The norm of the edges dropped in the second step over the norm of the edges dropped in the first step, etc. And if this is true, then when we map it into that lower dimensional Euclidean space, we have that, we can put a straight line between the 2 points and it goes through the allowed region, and then we could just map it back to our orthons in tree space to get the shortest path through them. And so we know what, because we had a straight line, we know what its distance was by the Euclidean distance formula. So that's going to be our property 2, that this metric condition is satisfied. And then, okay, so there's one more property we need. And so why do we need another property? So here is a path that satisfies property 1 and 2. So what are we doing? We're just dropping all the edges at once from this tree and adding all the ones from our second tree in. Okay. So clearly property 1 satisfied. Property 2, there's only one fraction or one ratio, so that's satisfied trivially. But this isn't the geodesic, right? Because I could shortcut through this orthon and get a shorter one. And so property 3 tells us when is there this orthon here that we can shortcut through. So it's got both a combinatorial part and a metric part to it. So what's a combinatorial part? Well, in our original path, we were dropping 2 edges and adding 2 edges. The combinatorial part is that we can actually separate out, we can somehow split up the step. So just drop, in this case, one of the edges, add one of the edges, and then drop another edge, add another edge. And the idea is that if we split it up, we're getting a valid tree here, right? Because that intermediate orthon must correspond to a valid tree. So that's the first part of the property, is that, well, we've got to be able to split up A1, the edges dropped into 2, and the edges added into 2, such that the ones we drop second are compatible, so it can be in the same tree with the edges we added in the first of our 2 steps. Right, so just that there is a tree here corresponding to that orthon. But that's actually not enough. So that tells us this orthon exists. But if we look at tree T2 prime, okay, fine, this orthon exists, but the geodesic does not go through it. Right? The geodesic from T1 to T2 prime goes through the cone path. But for T2, we would shortcut through it. And so what we need to check here to see if we can shortcut through it, because somehow we only want to add orthons if we know for sure the geodesic goes through the middle of them, not that we don't want to add this one even if it's cutting like along the boundary. So what's that condition? Well, it's that we're going, it depends, if I just take this line and just extend it out here, if the tree's on this side of that line, I'm going to be able to shortcut through here. And if the tree's on the other side, well, no, it's not. Having this orthon here doesn't help. And so that's just checking a property, so this property here. And the reasoning's not overly complicated, but I don't want to go into it now, but it's sort of similar to the reasoning for property 2. And so that's giving us property 3. So property 3 says that we've got the geodesic if we can't find some orthant that we can sort of take a shortcut through. So it says there can't be a partition such that we have this metric property. And then the theorem is that 2 partitions represent the geodesic if they satisfy the 3 properties I just mentioned. And then that sort of tells us how to get an algorithm. So what it says is we can start with the cone path. So going through the center, which I sort of argued before, right, was trivially properties 1 and 2 hold for that. And at every step, all I'm going to do is check. So for every of these transitions, I just check, is there actually some other orthant that I could my path really could be shortcutting through? And if so, I want to add that one in. And if not, I want to keep going. And when there's no more orthants I can add in, I know I found the geodesic. So you can see, right, I mean, because there's only so many orthants I can add in, because at most I'm changing one edge each time, so that's n minus 2 edges. As long as checking property 3 is polynomial, I have a polynomial algorithm. Right, so as long as checking is this extra orthant there, polynomial, then I'm good. And so how to check property 3 I think is kind of cute. So we have 2 parts here, right? We have to check, is there this orthant, and then does it satisfy these metric properties? We can look at a bipartite graph. So I'm going to label the vertices on this side, on one with the edges in AI, the edges I'm dropping, and label the vertices on the other side with the tree edges that I'm adding. I'm going to put a graph edge in between 2 of them if those 2 edges are, if the edge I drop and the edge I add, if those are incompatible, so can't exist in the same tree. Which would mean, right, so if there's an edge here, if I want to bring in this edge, this tree edge, I have to drop this tree edge. And so if I find a vertex cover, I know that and I look at what's not in my vertex cover, then there are no edges from, so the red is my vertex cover, there are no edges from these 3 tree edges to, so no graph edges from these 2 tree edges to this tree edge up here. So I found my set, right? I found my partition. So C2 is compatible with D1. So if I can find a vertex cover, then I've got that partition. I've split up my step. And I'm not going to go into the details. Okay, and then I can get the other part of my partition. I'm not going to go through the details, but if I weight the vertices and actually look for a minimum weight vertex cover with weight less than 1, if I can find that, then I've also satisfied that other metric condition I had. So the details actually aren't, so what I'm skipping is about a slide's worth, but so it's not very complicated math, but on the other hand, it's sort of not really worth doing in a talk. So solving weighted vertex cover, min-weight vertex cover problems on bipartite graphs can be done in O and 3 time. And you rephrase it as a max flow problem. And I should just mention, we can solve it in polynomial time because we had a bipartite graph. If you have an arbitrary graph, it's NP hard. And so that gives us a complexity of our algorithm of O to the n and to the 4th. And so, okay, so future work from this is, so generalizing this algorithm to other arbitrary cat0 spaces. So these cat0 cube complexes. Computing mean trees. So I'm going to talk briefly about that in a minute. Somehow doing principal component analysis on the space of phylogenetic trees to be able to cluster trees. And then eventually, so I'm also talking to some people at UNC about this. And then eventually, is figure out some ways to do statistics on trees using this tree space and geodesic distance. Okay, and so I just want to talk very briefly about mean trees. So what we can do is define a mean tree. So the idea for mean trees is what we want is we might have a set of trees representing where each tree is a most likely tree for a specific gene, right? And then we've looked at a bunch of genes. We've got all these gene trees. And we want to maybe try and find a mean for them and hope that is a species tree. And so we can define the mean tree as a center of mass. So the same way you define center of mass in Euclidean space. So basically, we want the tree that minimizes the sum of the square geodesic distances from that tree to each of the other trees, right? So from our candidate mean tree, right, we compute its geodesic distance to each of the other trees, square them, sum them up, and our candidate should be the one satisfying the minimizing that. And it turns out, so this could be a nonlinear optimization problem. It turns out that because we're on a non-positively curved metric space, there's this algorithm that Sturm gave in a paper in 2003 that gives a very simple algorithm for calculating this mean. So what we do is we pick a tree from our set, and that's going to be, so it's an iterative algorithm. And that's going to be our first mean candidate for the mean tree. And then at each step, what we do is we choose randomly one of our other trees from our set. And we take the geodesic from our current candidate for the mean tree to that new tree we've just chosen. Right? So we've got a path, and we pick the tree along it that's 1 over I plus 1 distance along that geodesic. So in the first step, right, I start with some tree. That's my mean candidate, M0. I pick some other tree, and so M1 would be the tree halfway along that geodesic. Then I'm going to pick some other tree that was in my set of gene trees, and now I'm going to choose as M2 to be the tree 1/3 of the way along that geodesic. Pick a new tree. I'm looking for the tree 1/4 of the way. And so this is an iterative algorithm, and it converges to the mean tree. Now, I should put some caveats on it. We've tried running it. It does converge in some cases. We're having problems getting it to converge in others. We're doing this for very small trees, and we're trying to. And so basically, right now, it's probably not very practical. But we're trying to get it to work this and maybe combine it with some nonlinear optimization. Do the nonlinear optimization approach to somehow get a way to calculate mean trees. But what this does is it gives us hope that there is a way to calculate them, and we should be able to get an algorithm to do that, to be able to do this. And then, of course, the next question is that mean we're calculating, how does that correspond to the species tree? Okay. So I just want to say thank you again for listening and for inviting me. And then this is the paper, which is up on the archive, for the algorithm for computing the geodesic distance polynomial time.
You have time for some questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Is this statement true? I'm thinking it's false, but
Okay.
if two trees have a common subtree, then does this subtree lie on the geodesic?
Okay. So that's a good question. So I actually completely did not talk about common subtrees. So, and that's because if it does have a common subtree, so by common subtree I mean some of the edges are the same in each tree, right? And it turns out that if some of the edges are the same, you can actually basically think of removing them from the tree, or you can think of removing them, and you get these. Say if there's just one common edge, you remove it from each tree, you get two pairs of trees. You can compute just the geodesic distance between those two. And those two geodesics, you can combine them to get the geodesic between your two original trees. Trying to think how to say it. Those two geodesics are going to be in spaces orthogonal to each other. Subspaces are orthogonal, and so when you combine them, you're just sort of putting together. Basically, each of the subtrees are morphing independently. So each subtree is morphing. If you think of it as going along the geodesic as morphing, they're just morphing independently. of each other. And then that middle, that common edge is, I mean, they may have different lengths in the two trees, and so it's just in a linear fashion, say, expanding to become the length it should be in the target tree.
So it does lie on the geodesic.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's actually, yeah, it's true. And it's a way to actually break down, because a lot of trees coming from biology do have a lot of common edges, just because you would not, if you've generated two trees that you think are, say, representing your true tree, you would not expect them to be completely different. So it does mean that you can break down the problem a lot.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
And I'm not exactly sure how accurate this question is.
Mm-hmm.
Evolution may or may not occur in this kind of minimum distance kind of way,
Mm-hmm.
but you're calculating the distance between trees in a kind of a minimum distance kind of way. How do you go about exploring how close it is to the actual evolutionary distance between two species?
I mean, so you've hit on, okay, so there's two, so yeah, I mean, so you've actually hit on, I think there's sort of maybe two parts to your question. So one thing is that within I'm trying to think. So within a tree, so the length of branches between, if you sum up the lengths of branches between the two species, that's sort of some representation of the distance. I mean, that's actually one way to look at tree reconstruction is you've got these distances between your sequences, and they may not correspond to a tree. And then you're trying to somehow fit the best tree possible. Yeah, and then this other part is what you're saying is why should these measures of distance between trees at all represent, and there is, I mean, that's actually sort of a problem with all distances people come up with phylogenetic trees. I'm trying to think. People sort of tried, and I can't think of anything off the top of my head, people sort of tried ways to somehow show, the sort of standard way seems to be that biologists have an idea what the true tree should be, and then if a distance seems to be giving them what they think should be correct, they say it's good. But I mean, this is a problem that there's no way to tell which distance is biologically more correct at this point in time. Yeah.
I have a question. Now, you didn't mention anything to the effect as what kind of limitation there was. I don't think there is any in terms of the number of nodes that you may have or something. But practically, have you found anything that where your algorithm runs into trouble?
Yeah. Well, so you're talking about the distance algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my collaborators at Duke, they've been running it on trees with 500 leaves, and it's or 600, and they said it's doing fine. I mean, at some point it is going to run into trouble,
Right.
but we're not.
But nothing.
So far, we haven't found. I don't remember how fast. They said it was still pretty fast. It was not. I mean, it wasn't instantaneous by that point, but it was still. It's definitely like running in a reasonable time. So no, we haven't. We don't know what the upward bound is right now. Yeah.
Is the algorithm parallelizable?
Yeah, so that's another good question. So so someone's asked me about that before. So you can parallelize it in that checking for those intermediate orthons could be done. So so at first you're just adding and dropping one set of edges. So you have to check that. And if that splits you in two, you have to check each of those. So you could do that in parallel. And then so that I think would maybe make it be n cubed log n. So I mean I haven't done it out, but usually if you can parallelize stuff like that, that gives you changes your n into log n. And then if there was some way to parallelize the min vertex cover problem, if there's something out there that lets you parallelize that, then that would, whatever reductions you have on that, that's the bulk of the complexity, right? Because right now we were just using n cubed to find the min vertex cover. Like we didn't look very hard. We just sort of looked in a textbook to see what it said the algorithm was, and what its complexity. So there may be something better there. And then any savings there would translate into savings in our algorithm. But so far, that's the only what we know. Yeah.
All right. If there are no more questions, let's thank our speaker again.